And Slippin' Jimmy I can handle just fine, but Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun.
This is the finale of the first season of Better Call Saul, and it is the saddest moment for the protagonist, Jimmy. He thought that his hard-earned achievements would gain his brother's approval, but instead, it brought jealousy and rejection from his brother. Heartbroken, Jimmy couldn't accept this reality and decided to part ways with his brother in a fit of anger. Human nature often changes under such painful blows, and from this moment on, Jimmy will gradually liberate his true self. Just like how Walter began to release his long-suppressed nature after learning he had lung cancer. After learning the truth, Jimmy went to the HHM law firm and decided to follow Kim's advice to hand over the Sandpiper Crossing case to Howard. Kim wondered why Jimmy changed his mind again. Jimmy had to confess that Chuck didn't want him to be a lawyer at HHM. Hearing this, Kim wasn't surprised. Jimmy guessed that she already knew the truth. He asked Kim why she didn't tell him, and Kim said she didn't want to see Jimmy hate his brother. Howard thought it was Kim who told Jimmy the truth. Jimmy retorted that he figured it out himself. Howard apologized to Jimmy for his actions. Jimmy also understood the truth and expressed understanding because Howard had to follow Chuck's arrangements for the company's sake. Jimmy also apologized for his extreme behavior. Howard generously paid Jimmy a $20,000 advance, and he would get a 20% commission after the case was concluded. This would be a considerable income. Then Jimmy gave Howard a list of items he usually bought for Chuck and explained in detail how to take care of Chuck. Howard was surprised by Jimmy's meticulous care for Chuck. If it weren't for the company's considerations, Howard would definitely stand by Jimmy's side. As Jimmy was about to leave, Howard expressed his recognition of Jimmy and said he had always admired him. Thus, their relationship finally eased. As he left the HHM law firm, the trash can that Jimmy had once hit violently came into view again. This was also a callback to the scene in the first episode, indicating that Jimmy's mindset had changed. Jimmy apologized to Kim for his outburst. Kim accepted the apology and gave Jimmy a big hug. She urged Jimmy to vent his inner dissatisfaction, but Jimmy didn't do so because the hurt he suffered had made him more mature. At the nursing home, Jimmy stood his last post and once again played bingo with the elderly. Affected by his emotions, he explained each letter and number on the bingo balls in a negative and pessimistic manner. The host looked at him in astonishment, and even the audience felt that today's Jimmy seemed like a different person, because the first few numbers he drew all started with B. Jimmy felt at a loss for words.
Hey, here's another B! B5, as in, boy, this B thing is really starting to tick me off. B as in battleship, B as in bourbon.
The Belize that Jimmy mentioned here is also referred to in Breaking Bad. When Hank just discovered that Walter was Heisenberg, Jimmy advised Walter to send Hank to Belize, meaning to eliminate Hank, but Walter insisted on refusing. Jimmy rolled another ball starting with B, and this time he really couldn't think of anything to say. He realized he was not in good shape today, so he straightforwardly revealed the black history of his Chicago sunroof incident, which was also a turning point in his life. Because his ex-wife had an affair with a wealthy man, Jimmy got divorced. Then one day he drank a few glasses of booze and happened to meet the tycoon driving a Mercedes Maybach parked on the side of the road. In order to retaliate under the stimulation of alcohol, Jimmy decisively went up to send a piece of shit. But Jimmy never thought that the tycoon's 2 children are still in the back seat, and his sunroof from the outside cannot see the inside. What he thought would be a minor charge of property damage and disturbing the peace turned into a serious accusation of sexual assault. As the wealthy man had connections with the police, this was why Jimmy went to jail and later begged his brother Chuck to bail him out. After this incident, to avoid disappointing his brother, Jimmy reluctantly said goodbye to his friend Marco in Chicago. He then followed his brother's arrangement and came to Albuquerque to work in the mailroom at HHM. 10 years later, not only did Jimmy fail to gain Chuck's approval, but Chuck also couldn't accept him after he passed the bar exam. Reflecting on these tragic life experiences, Jimmy finally couldn't hold back anymore.
And that's where it all went off the rails. I've been paying for it ever since. That's why I'm here!
Emotionally overwhelmed, Jimmy abruptly ended the game. He let each elderly person come up to claim a prize, then threw down the microphone and walked away. The scene then shifted to a bar in Chicago where Jimmy had once said goodbye to Marco. At that moment, Marco was already fast asleep at the bar. Jimmy ordered 2 bottles of the beer they used to drink and then approached Marco to start teasing him.
Marco. Wake up, you fat son of a...
Seeing Slippin' Jimmy, whom he hadn't seen in 10 years, woke Marco from his sleep. The two of them shared updates about their lives. Since losing Jimmy as his best partner, Marco had found a new job. During the conversation, Marco coughed and occasionally pounded his chest with his fist. This also foreshadowed the upcoming plot. Marco asked Jimmy about the purpose of his visit, but Jimmy didn't reveal anything. After paying the bill, Jimmy casually pulled a fake coin out of his pocket and then skillfully focused on a customer who was on the phone. After asking Marco, he learned that the person was not a regular. Jimmy wanted to relive the feeling they used to have. Marco, who hadn't done this in a while, smiled knowingly and then ran to the bar to get into position. The two pretended not to know each other, and Jimmy began to pitch the fake 50-cent coin to Marco. They deliberately spoke loudly to catch the attention of the stranger. After Jimmy's spiel, the stranger indeed noticed their conversation. Jimmy hyped up the rare coin's value at $800 but said he was willing to sell it for $100 because he needed the money urgently. In the middle of the conversation, Jimmy deliberately chatted with the stranger to ensure he could hear their discussion. This was also to make it natural for Marco to discuss Jimmy's coin later, but the stranger didn't believe Jimmy's story. Thinking he was just trying to scam people, Marco pretended not to believe it either. At this point, Jimmy excused himself to the bathroom and told Marco to think it over. It was time for Marco to show his real skills. First, the two started discussing Jimmy's scamming behavior, using it as a topic to draw closer to each other. Then Marco hesitated and said he had a friend who was a coin dealer and planned to call him for advice. Marco dialed a random number and then started talking seriously, his tone rising and falling as if he were having a genuine conversation, successfully piquing the stranger's curiosity. To make the stranger even more curious, Marco deliberately turned his back to speak on the phone. After a while, the stranger asked Marco what was going on. Marco pretended that his friend was unsure but that he was still ready to pay Jimmy for the coin. Seeing the two start to haggle, the stranger took the bait completely.
Sorry, I need 100.
Hey, Slick, nobody's talking to you. Mind your own business, okay? Come on.
Cash money, $80.
If you give me a chance, I'll be back with $110.
How long will that be?
I don't know. I gotta catch a train, come back, hour
Yeah,
and a half
this
at the
guy was
most.
getting ready to call
No,
cops on you.
I
What?
was not.
Why would you do that?
Now this guy is making shit up.
Hey, I got 110 right here.
Sold.
No.
This guy's got the cash now.
Don't do
Here,
that.
take care of that. It's history right there.
Hey, you can't do that.
Hey, money talks. You lost. It's over.
You come back in here and your ass is grass. I got friends, buddy. You hear me? You double dealing bastard. I got friends.
In this way, they successfully pulled off the scam. Truly, life is like a play, and it's all about acting, but they only targeted those who were greedy. Then Marco and Jimmy began a week-long campaign of deception. All kinds of tricks are endless, only you cannot think of nothing they cannot do. This also teaches us that we mustn't be greedy, or many unforeseen traps will be set just for us. It seemed that only through this did Marco and Jimmy find their true selves. The thrill of manipulating human nature became increasingly addictive for Marco and Jimmy, bringing them great satisfaction. But what shocked the audience was that Jimmy not only scammed money but also seduced women.
Hey, you are not Kevin Costner.
I was last night.
After a few crazy days, Jimmy finally put his troubles behind him. He turned on his phone, which had been off for several days, and found more than a dozen messages from clients, all elderly people wanting him to write their wills. Awaking, Marco asked Jimmy what he wanted to do today, but Jimmy said he had to go back. He said his clients needed him. It was only then that Marco learned Jimmy was a lawyer. Thinking that Jimmy's scam targets had shifted to the elderly, but Jimmy insisted he had never scammed them. Marco was very surprised to find out that his old buddy, Slippin' Jimmy, was actually a lawyer. In his eyes, lawyers made a lot of money, and Jimmy should be driving around in a Cadillac. This also echoes the white Cadillac that Saul drives in Breaking Bad later on and makes a lot of money, but the not yet transformed Jimmy was still living in dire straits. Marco remarked that being a lawyer in Chicago was also very lucrative, so why go to Albuquerque? But Jimmy's answer left Marco speechless, because Chuck was in Albuquerque. Although Chuck didn't think much of him, he was still his brother, and Jimmy couldn't stop worrying about him. Marco asked Jimmy to accompany him in selling the last fake Rolex, but Jimmy said he didn't want to do it. However, Jimmy couldn't resist Marco's persistent requests. The scene shifted, and Marco was still on that familiar street, but his health was deteriorating, and he couldn't stop coughing. Soon, Jimmy gave the signal, indicating that Marco could get ready to act. Jimmy led a stranger named Kevin down an alley. According to their plan, Kevin found a wallet that Marco had dropped on the ground. He counted about $1,000 inside. Jimmy deliberately had Kevin discover Marco lying on the ground before he found a stick to poke Marco. But this time, Marco didn't respond. Jimmy took a closer look and realized something was wrong. He immediately called Marco's name and asked Kevin to call for help. Seeing through the scam, Kevin grabbed the wallet and ran off, ignoring the chase. Jimmy quickly called for an ambulance. At that moment, Marco suddenly woke up.
You know what?
Save your breath, okay? You're gonna be fine.
This was the greatest week of my life.
After saying his final heartfelt words, Marco left this world contentedly. To commemorate Marco, his mother gave Jimmy Marco's ring. This ring would play a significant role in the later storyline, symbolizing their pure friendship and shared principles. Just then, Jimmy received a call from Kim. After learning that Jimmy had calmed down, she updated him on the Sandpiper Crossing case. Because the case was so big, Howard decided to collaborate with the DM law firm. Moreover, the DM law firm had heard of Jimmy's reputation and was willing to extend an olive branch, inviting Jimmy to become a partner to work on this case. They even provided Jimmy with a luxurious office. Since the clients preferred to deal directly with Jimmy, this was a great opportunity he couldn't refuse. He thanked Kim for her efforts, but Kim didn't take all the credit and said Howard had also worked hard on this. It had to be said, Kim was truly considerate of Jimmy. The scene shifted to Chuck, who was instructing Ernesto, sent by Howard, to buy supplies. To ensure Ernesto didn't miss anything or buy the wrong items, Chuck reminded him to write everything down in a notebook. Compared to Jimmy's care, Chuck had to put in much more effort now. When Ernesto came out, he happened to see Jimmy, who had just returned. Since they had both worked in the mailroom, they were good friends. Although standing at his brother's doorstep, Jimmy didn't go in. He just asked Ernesto about Chuck's recent condition. Inside, Chuck noticed Jimmy's presence and hesitated at the door, unsure whether to open it. Before he could decide, Jimmy had already left. Despite the rift between them, familial love still made them care about each other. Jimmy then went to the parking lot, tidied himself up, and prepared to meet with the DM law firm's boss. But just as he reached the door, Jimmy stopped. He touched Marco's ring, and in that moment, he seemed to understand something. Jimmy decisively gave up this rare opportunity. He then drove to the parking booth to talk to Mike. He couldn't understand why Mike didn't split the $1.6 million embezzled from the Kettleman couple when they could have gotten away with it without paying taxes. Only they would know, and no one else. Mike clearly remembered Jimmy's words. At that time, Jimmy thought it was the right thing to do. Now, Jimmy felt he had been foolish and swore never to do such a thing again.
I know what stopped me. And you know what? It's never stopping me again.
From that moment, Slip and Jimmy officially began his dark path to becoming Saul Goodman.